After a year fighting for breath, she was ready to quit.
She said goodbye to her husband and 4 daughters.
Then, a last-minute message.
I found lungs for you.
Struck by a deadly virus.
There were 4 times when Charlie stopped breathing.
He never stopped believing.
He loves being alive. He is dedicated to his recovery.
A night of partying, a bright future changed forever.
They were cooling his body down to mitigate damage to his brain, and he had a ventilator.
On the front lines of medicine. Tales from the ICU, next on Chronicle.
Good evening, everyone. The intensive care unit is where you can see the best of modern medicine, technologies and treatments that give desperately sick patients a chance at life.
And now a local ICU doctor is giving us a look inside. And the stories she tells are compelling and inspiring. Cindy Scribner, a registered nurse and mother of 4 daughters, was having trouble breathing.
Her lungs were never going to recover. She was scared, and she tried not to show her children that she was scared.
Just days after hosting a backyard party, Charlie Atkinson began to slur his words and was suddenly unable to walk.
It was West Nile virus. No treatment was possible. What was possible was keeping him alive.
26-year-old Ben Clancy had just landed his dream job. A night of celebration would cost him.
The EMTs were able to come and revive him and bring him to Mass General, where we found him, and he was unconscious.
These are 3 of the patients in Dr. Daniela Lamas's new book, You Can Stop Humming Now. The book takes readers inside the critical care units of Boston area hospitals, where top quality staff and cutting-edge technology often triumph over even the most desperate cases. But at what price? The book's central question, at what point does intervention become too much?
Mind if I just take a listen to your lungs?
I'm an ICU doctor, so my clinical experiences during fellowship were largely in the intensive care unit. That's where these stories come from. Sort of the nidus of them is all in a critical moment. But what I try to do in this book is to look beyond the ICU at what happens to people afterwards. And so that takes me from the ICU into patients' homes, into the world with them.
28-year-old Cindy Scribner's symptoms began with shortness of breath and a tickle-like cough. At first, doctors said she was fine, but her cough persisted. Months later, while at work, she had trouble breathing. Doctors discovered her lungs were failing.
Cindy was stricken with a scarring disease of her lungs called pulmonary fibrosis. She got on the transplant list, but then she got so sick that if it were not for this machine that would serve the purpose of her lungs, she would have died.
In her room at Brigham and Women's Hospital, the machine that kept Cindy alive is called an ECMO.
So extracorporeal membrane oxygenation is a machine somewhat like dialysis for the kidneys that serves the purpose of the lungs, and it draws blood out of the body through a large catheter, often in the neck. It's not good enough that you can leave the ICU with it.
Cindy's husband and daughters were regular visitors, boosting her spirits and resolve. But living on the ECMO was more than challenging. It was brutal.
She suffered significant complications while waiting. She had a lot of problems with bleeding. And with each bleeding episode, she became weaker. And her doctors and Cindy herself started to wonder whether perhaps what she was going through for a diminishing possibility as time went on of a transplant, perhaps that pain outweighed the increasingly unlikely benefit.
Weeks turned into months. After almost a year in the hospital and over 2 months attached to the ECMO machine, Cindy Scribner had her 23rd stomach bleed. Her surgeon was on his way into the hospital.
And as he made the calls to book another OR and thought of Cindy and her children and the weeks and weeks of suffering that they had gone through, he wondered, so he told me, whether perhaps this wasn't the right thing to do, that maybe they had gotten to a point where they were all so connected to this patient. Perhaps they weren't able to see that what they were doing was to her instead of for her. The burden was on her team to say, we see that you're suffering. A transplant is becoming less likely. I think the worst thing that we sometimes do is just go on and don't offer that pause point and offer people to say, yeah, I'm done.
That day, Cindy Scribner made an agonizing decision. She could not go on. She said goodbye to her husband and 4 daughters.
Later that evening, like after going through all that and getting to terms, like I was all set with everything and saying goodbye to everybody, he comes in and he was like, well, I know we're not doing the surgery, but I found lungs for you. And that was the last thing I remembered.
At the moment Cindy Scribner was ready to die, she was given an opportunity to live. On November 1st, 2014, Cindy Scribner underwent a double lung transplant.
And I woke up the next day with lungs, and I could breathe. And it was like amazing. I couldn't believe it. It was like a miracle.
Wow. And Dr. Lamas says the fact that Cindy's husband and children visited her regularly played a huge role in her recovery.
Right, and she sees this a lot. Families who are regular visitors involved in the care of their loved ones absolutely help the recovery of those who are ill. What it also helps is that she, as a doctor, and other caregivers get to know the patient better by getting to know the family, and that helps them as well in terms of treatment and care.
Just incredible. A mosquito bite turned his life upside down.
The idea that I'd ever go home was a fervent hope and a distant dream.
"82-year-old Charlie Atkinson is lucky to be alive.
Ambulance took him to Mass General, and he was admitted to the regular floor. And that first night, they said, we need to put in a breathing tube. If you have a breathing tube, you also then have to have the feeding tube as well.
5 years ago, a mosquito bite left him with a severe case of West Nile virus.
I think the odds were against Charlie. Charlie was a really healthy guy who got West Nile virus that resulted in this polio-like paralysis. If we talk about just numbers of people who look like Charlie, who need the tracheostomy tube because they can't get off the ventilator, of these people, about half will die. These are the people who only 1 in 10 will be home and independent in a year.
After 5 weeks, Charlie was moved from Mass General to Spalding Rehab in Cambridge. There was progress, and there were setbacks.
The idea that I'd ever go home was a fervent hope and a distant dream, but not a possibility. The going home was a constant thing, and how important it was to get right back here.
For a time, doctors at Spalding Rehab felt Charlie's progress had plateaued. They gave Jeanette the bad news. It was time to start looking for a nursing home.
We looked at nursing homes. The only one that would take Charlie with the ventilator and the needs that he had was west of Worcester. And if he had been in that type of sort of limbo, it wouldn't have been much of a life.
Maybe it's just looking at it now. There certainly is a point where you have to call it quits. And the idea of keeping people in warehouses in a state like I was for the rest of my life, it would not have been worth living, and I hope I had the guts to call it quits.
But when faced with that choice,
they brought me a form to sign with a DNR, do not resuscitate. And it's one of those things that theoretically, I really believe in that. But when it came time to making a decision, I thought long and hard about that and decided not to sign it.
There were 4 times when Charlie stopped breathing, twice at Spalding and twice at home.
modern medicine does have all these interventions, so there's a lot at your disposal to keep people going, but how do you initiate this conversation about what's best? Who gets to make that choice?
To know what the right thing is to do for somebody, you need to ask. Faced with similar situations, people are going to have very different responses, and our goal is to help them get to whatever life they would find acceptable given their medical realities. And sometimes that's not the same decisions we would make, and that's okay too.
During that whole time, even though I thought it was quite possible that Charlie could die, it wasn't something that I dwelt on at all. There was a very day-to-day feeling about it, and it was an achievement of that day, perhaps to stand on the parallel bars. That was a red letter day, or a day that was a step back if he needed more time on the vent or couldn't sit up for a long time. It was much more a day-to-day thing.
As the days turned into months, Charlie Atkinson began improving. 14 months after that mosquito bite, Charlie Atkinson left Spaulding Rehab, his support and care now in the hands of his dedicated wife.
When Charlie came home, I would never, ever, ever want to relive those. The responsibility, the lack of knowledge, the limited training that we got, the calls to the ambulance to go make emergency trips to Mass General. We were so unprepared for looking after that serious level, and I hadn't had a clue. We had some very nice times, but oh my gosh, the responsibility of that was really difficult. It was really bad.
I think I can take a little walk on the wild side.
But the Atkinson family got through it, and Charlie is improving daily.
He was unlucky to get West Nile the way he did, but lucky that he slowly started to improve, and lucky that he has amazing sort of reserve, just personal reserve, where he loves being alive. He is dedicated to his recovery. He celebrates every gain that he makes, and in his early 80s now, he has tons of plans for the future. He is the 1 in 10.
Crawling out of that and seeing the possibility of getting better every day. I'm walking at 2 miles an hour. I'm now walking without a cane. I'm planning to be on the tennis court in July.
Wow, that's just great. And Charlie just celebrated his 60th college reunion from Harvard.
Yeah, and that was his goal. One of his goals was to get there and attend all the events. He was able to do that, even have a dance with his wife, Jeanette, which was lovely. And being goal-oriented really has helped him. As you heard throughout the piece, he was always setting goals for himself and reaching those goals, and that really helped him to move forward.
That's smart. Up next, a bright future changes with one night of partying.
Ben Clancy excelled on the football field in high school. He loved jazz guitar and was the kind of guy who could entertain a crowd. His parents were thrilled when he was accepted to a small liberal arts school in upstate New York to major in public policy. He graduated in 2015.
He had a really big heart. He was always kind to everyone when he felt like they weren't getting a fair shake. And he was going to go work for a company that was doing some environmental work for companies in big buildings and that sort of thing. He was really looking forward to it.
That was the plan until
he and his friends had a party and they did a lot of drugs. And he stopped breathing and his heart stopped beating, and they figured out eventually to call an ambulance, and the EMTs were able to come and revive him and bring him to Mass General. And he was unconscious when we got there.
Ben's heart had stopped. It had been restarted. They were cooling his body down to mitigate damage to his brain, and he had a ventilator.
Andrea and Brian Clancy heard the doctor's short-term plan for Ben. They would stop medications and re-warm him. They waited anxiously.
And initially, their only hope, the only thing they could think was, please, to let their son live.
How's it breathing?
I saw a lot of patients in the long-term acute care hospital where I do some work. Increasingly, they were young people who had had an opiate overdose and had been resuscitated, but were not okay. And I was really interested by this question about brain injury, where it takes a while for us to know what it can look like.
After 4 weeks in Mass General and then 8 weeks at Spaulding Rehab in Charlestown, Ben Clancy would finally go home.
By the time I met them, it was different. It was all right. He's alive. We're no longer afraid every moment that he will die. I think at least there was a question of, will he end up being able to live independently? Will he end up having friends that he can talk to?
Shortly after Ben got home, he was out on the golf course. He was walking and talking.
He wasn't I wouldn't say very vocal, because if you knew Ben before, he was very vocal. But he could answer questions, even if they were simple. He could make statements. He could tell you what he wanted.
Then, a setback.
He did end up with pneumonia about October of 2016. Since then, he really never quite got back to where he was before that. Yes or no? Now we're lucky if we get a sentence in a day. We're kind of behind where we were when Daniela met him to write her chapter in the book.
He was living back at home, but he wasn't the same. He was quiet, wasn't certain how well he would even be able to walk or do the daily activities of living an independent life. And you know, some of the questions that I wanted to know were sort of how was his mother able to navigate that?
Good job.
Not knowing how close he could get to the Ben that he was, you know, did that question paralyze her? And the answer was no. You know, she did the things that she had to do each day and tried to find meaning in who her son was at that moment, while also holding on to the hope that things would get better.
For the Clancys, it's yet another new normal.
We have to help him really with every part of daily living. We have a lot of doctor's appointments and a lot of therapy, physical therapy and speech therapy and occupational therapy, and he's working with therapists to come up with a new program to communicate with us because he's really not very verbal.
And so his life is much different than the life he was going to have, but his mother and his family continue to work to give him things that he enjoys and to help him find meaning in what he can.
Ben's family used to call him the Sandwich Man because he liked to make and eat sandwiches day and night. His mother was thrilled when she heard.
The other day we were playing around with the iPad and he typed, I was in the other room and he typed in sandwich time, which just made me laugh because we always called him Sandwich Man. So that was an initiation that we haven't seen in a really long time. So that's very exciting, good progress. Did he do it the next day? No. But once we'll take it. He could do it tomorrow, right?
Oh, in the NICU?
When Brigham and Women's doctor Daniela Lamas isn't tending to patients, she's working on improving care for the future.
I'm part of a group that looks at communication around serious illness, and we try to devise methods to improve communication, particularly when you're having a stressful conversation, to have a clear guide of language to turn to. What was it like to learn that?
Devastating.
I'm also building this post-intensive care clinic, so a clinic for people to return to the hospital after they've survived an ICU stay, so we can learn more about what their lives are like and whether they're suffering from any of these problems: anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress.
So you've mentioned PTSD, and we all are familiar with that in a sort of post-war environment, but how does that apply itself to patients who are leaving an ICU or a critical care environment?
The post-traumatic stress that people have, it's not that they flash back to waking up on a ventilator. It's often to these sort of horrifying nightmares that they had while they're sedated. So often they might flash back to, like, there was blood on the walls, there were bugs on people's faces. One woman told me that she believed her brain had been cut and 7/8 removed. Really, it's a reflection of the fact that what we do to and for people with the goal of getting them back to their lives is often in and of itself a trauma. I think recognizing that is hard, but it's important.
In the ICU and in her book, Dr. Lamas stresses doctors must help patients navigate difficult decisions by laying out the facts, no matter how dire. Then it's the doctor's job to listen intently and finally to follow patients' wishes.
My takeaway really is that what people are able to tolerate and sort of, you know, what lives they find acceptable, that these are different from person to person and they change over time, and we can't know them until we ask. And I think anybody reading the book, you know, they can begin to think, you know, what would I do? There's always what ifs, and there's always this sort of possibility of a miracle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is willing to go through what we have to offer to get to that possibility.
The book is really a clear-eyed and compassionate look at the choices, the difficult choices faced by both the doctors and the patients in these critical care environments, choices that many families will have to make over time. Links to the book on our website.
Great show, great reporting. That is Chronicle for tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Shayna Seymour.
I'm Anthony Everett. We'll see you tomorrow night.